Good afternoon. In my last year's talk at Philly ET, I discussed some aspects of domain modeling, mainly from the point of view of designing domain-specific languages, or DSLs as we call them. Now, DSLs as we know them can be designed as a thin layer of linguistic abstraction on top of what we call a domain model. Ideally, the domain model needs to be agnostic of the surface syntax which the DSL gives on top of it. So, we always try to focus on coming up with a robust domain model which honors all the principles of building good abstractions. So, in today's talk, I will discuss the some of the aspects of domain modeling, not from the DSL point of view, but from the layer underneath. Now, what's meant by a domain model? When we talk about a domain, the domain model should faithfully portray the behaviors which the domain executes in course of its life cycle. So, as we engineer a domain model, we need to be careful of things like separation of concerns, building better abstractions which collaborate amongst themselves in a way which replicate the behavior which the domain also offers. Now, there are scenarios where the platform becomes some constraint and we tend to ignore what the domain offers and reach some of the compromises. So, in this talk, I will discuss one architectural paradigm towards domain modeling, which is not being used frequently these days, but I am sure it has the potential to become one of the potent combinations in domain modeling. The basic tenets of this architectural paradigm are functional programming and event sourcing, or event-based handling of state changes. Before I go into the meat of the subject, some of my coordinates. I am Debashish G on Twitter. I have a GitHub where some of the open source codes are there, and I have a blog. And in December 2010, I wrote a book named DSLs in Action, which discusses many of the aspects of designing domain-specific languages using a variety of languages, starting from statically typed ones and the dynamically typed ones. These are some of the things which I will touch upon in course of today's discussion. Domain modeling. In domain modeling, if you have gone through the domain modeling book that Eric Evans has written, Domain Driven Design, you will see that he mainly classifies a domain abstraction into the core domain abstractions and the service layer. I will follow the same terminology, and what I will try to show is designing the domain models, the domain abstractions in a functional way offers you some potent benefits because of the purity that it lends to your design. We will discuss some of the virtues of immutable abstractions, and by virtue of having immutability baked into your design, you get a chance to localize your side effects. So, your model becomes much more easier for you to reason about your model. The other thing that I will talk about is event sourcing, event-based architectures, which offers an alternate way to model state changes. Instead of doing in-place mutation on objects, we will use events to model a state change as a stream of events which can be persisted in a persistent store. So, doing that, we will have the capability that as and when required, we can replay the events. In fact, we can go back in time and restore the system at any point in time, even in the past, as we wish. So, event sourcing offers event sourcing is basically manipulation of a stream of immutable objects, immutable events. Events can never be updated. It can only be appended to. So there's an interesting duality in architecture between what functional programming offers us and the ideas that we get from event-based models. Event sourcing doesn't allow you to mutate, and functional models also encourage immutability. So we will discuss about this duality too. And at the end, I will discuss an implementation, a sample event-sourced domain model implementation, where we will model a small part of a domain using functional abstractions, and then see how we can model the state changes using event sourcing. How many of you have gone through Eric Evans' domain-driven design book? Yeah, it's actually a classic, and we should read it. Here, when we talk about domains, the two key aspects which we will focus on are, one is the domain behavior, how the various domain functions behave, and the other thing is external context. A domain model always has to interact with an external context, and it's one of the architectural paradigms that how we handle those events which comes from the external context. And this is one of the good practices of domain modeling. We can think of a domain model as being comprised of core granular abstractions that handle the business logic. So the core abstractions will be at the finer grained level because they can be reused. The finer the abstractions are, more is the potential for being reusable. And on top of those abstractions, we will have the coarser level domain services, which will actually do the interaction with the external world. Interacting with the external world implies side effects. You write to a database, you read from a file, you take user inputs. So what we can do is we can restrict those side effects or the so-called impurities at the service layer and focus on making our actual core domain abstractions as pure as possible. Functional programming offers immutability, purity, and the ability to reason about your model. I am not saying that your entire domain model will be side effect free. That's not possible, because in reality there are state changes and states do change. But the idea of by using a functional programming language or using the paradigms of functional programming, what you can do is you can localize your side effects. You can identify a portion of your code which does those side effecty things, but the rest of the code remains pure. So with the rest of the code, you can do lots of reasoning. You can reorder some of the executions and get some parallelism for free. These are the basic tenets. Our intent will be to use mostly pure abstractions for building the domain model. Composability becomes much more easier. You can compose pure functions in a much more easier way than functions with side effects. For modeling domain behaviors, we will try to use pure functions. Immutable artifacts has some basic advantages, as I was telling you, and some parallelism will be free because you can reorder operations that are fundamentally pure. Now let's look at some of the ways using which we can make our abstractions immutable and pure. Algebraic data types for representation of domain entities. Shortly, we will see some code snippets on how to implement these things. Updates. Updates are in-place updates are basically mutable, right? But in functional programming, there are some data structures like type lenses, which we can use to implement updates functionally. We will see some examples in Scala using the type lens implementation from the Scala library called Scala Z. And in-place mutation is discouraged. And we will see some impacts of some benefits of avoiding in-place mutation even with event-driven models. This is an example of an algebraic data type from the domain of financial securities industry, securities trading. This is a very much simplified model of what a security trade actually looks like. But the point that I want to emphasize here is that all the parameters to this case class are immutable. All of them are vals, as we call them in Scala. So this is an example of an algebraic data type in Scala. We can create instances of trade, but when we design our domain models, there may be some objects which are singleton, so to say. And you can design singleton objects using this object syntax of Scala. So algebraic data types as object representation. Nothing mutable, everything immutable. And we will see how we can implement functional updates on top of this while retaining our immutability. When we are modeling a domain, the domain behaviors need to be modeled in such a way so that it becomes expressive, even to a user who is not very much familiar with the programming model. And one of the criteria for that is to reduce the surface area of your API implementation. Functional programming with pure functions, we can compose. Functional programming gives us the ability to compose smaller abstractions into larger ones. This is an example. When we go through a trading life cycle, a trade object, one of the business functions which we need to do on top of a trade object is to get the list of tax and fees which will be applied on top of that trade object while doing valuation for the trade. So this is an example where these tax fees, they depend on the market of execution. And the business rule states that we need to get, when we have the trade, we need to get the market information from the trade itself. But it's a very frequent occurrence that the market information is missing from the trade. In that case, we need to get one default depending on the country of execution. So this one line of code actually does this entire thing by using function composition. This operator here, it's actually a combinator which composes the two. So what happens is that if we get the market from the first call, then it uses that market, or else it proceeds to get the other one, get the default market from its context. Here is one more example. In course of the life cycle of a trade needs to be enriched with various kinds of information. It's the tax fee information, and once we get the tax fee information, then the net valuation of the trade needs to be computed. With this kind of functional composition, we can do it in a manner which looks pretty expressive. The for comprehension, those of you who were there in Tony's session, this is the comprehension syntax in Scala, where we chain the results of one step into the other using flat maps and maps. So it explicitly states the intent of the code. Within the for comprehension, we first get the tax fee IDs for a trade, and using the magic of maps and flat maps, those tax fee IDs get induced into the computation method, which calculates the tax fee values. And finally, we have the tax fee values. And then we finally compute the tax fees and update the trade. I will go into more details on how we use the lens very shortly. But here, this tax fee lens is a data structure which allows us to update the data structure, update a trade with the tax fee information in a purely functional way. Here is one more example. I am not going into the details of this implementation, but by virtue of these 3-4 small snippets, we have virtually implemented most of the business logic which we need to do in order to do the valuation of a trade. As I was mentioning, the secret sauce is composability. Functions compose just as in mathematics. And if we use a language which supports functional programming, then there we can pass functions as first-class citizens. We can use them as return values. And if we can make them pure, we can treat them just as mathematically as you would like to do. So even in the earlier examples, even in this example, we compose the various results using the power of maps and flat maps. And this we get from the language machinery itself. We don't have to write a single line of code for this. Let's look at a different point of view of how we can update a data structure while building our domain model. A type lens is a data structure that sets up a bidirectional transformation between a set of source structures S and target structures T. The idea of type lens was first, I think, conceived by Dr. Benjamin Pierce, and it was in context of view updates in a relational database. How we can update a view in a relational database using functional techniques. Basically, a type lens is set up as a pair of functions, one which allows us to get something out of a data structure, and one more function which is the putback, which takes the original structure and the changes and gives us back a modified structure. S cross T, it takes S and T and gives back S. So a type lens models an update in a purely functional way as a pair of functions. We will see how we can implement this in Scala. This is an example. We have a data structure lens which takes two parameters, trade and string. And this data structure is meant to update a reference number that's there within the trade. Here we model this as a pair of functions. The first one is the get function, which I showed in the last slide, which takes a trade and returns its reference number. And the second function does a functional update, updates a trade with a supplied reference number. We will see how we can use this lens shortly. But really, what's the big deal with this type lens? What advantages do they offer? Once again, we go back to composability. Lens compose. And since the basic concept of composition comes from mathematics, if we can design our abstractions in a composable way, if we can design abstractions that compose, then really there's no limit in building larger abstractions out of smaller ones. So here, what we are doing, we are defining an address lens, which takes a person and an address, and it allows us to update the address of a person. And we have one more lens, which takes an address and a string, and allows us to update the street information, which is the string. Now suppose we have, typically when we design any domain abstraction, our structures are nested, right? We have within trade, we have some structure, we have some structure. So it's really a nested collection of structures. And if we need to go every step in order to do updates, then the syntax becomes a bit cumbersome. Luckily for us, lens is an abstraction which composes. So we can define one more lens, person street lens, where we can directly update the street information given the person. Here the nesting is person, address, and then the street information. But we can compose the two lenses, street lens and address lens, and doing that, we can get a bigger lens where we can directly jump into the nested street field and do an update. Like this. Person street L, get person will give me the street, and I can get a new person with the updated street information by directly supplying the street information to the composed lens. Scala Z library contains an implementation of this lens data structure. So in our domain model, we can define our various lenses like this. Every lens is defined as implemented as a pair of functions. Okay, so far so good. We can design individual abstractions as algebraic data types. We can do functional updates using lenses. But when we are designing a domain model, we cannot avoid states, because domain objects don't exist in isolation. And when we have an abstraction like trade, when it passes through the machinery of its life cycle in course of a trading system, in that case, there really is a series of changes, series of state changes through which it has to go in order to go to the final state. Every object, every data object starts in the created state when it's a new instance, and then we apply various business rules on top of it in order to go down to the final state. Objects need to interact with other objects and respond to events from the external world. These state changes which the object undergoes, these state changes can be in response to events from internal system or from the external world. But we need to have a generic paradigm, generic architectural paradigm to handle all such events and execute these state changes in a functional way. We will see how we can do that. Now, this is a sample snapshot in the life of a trade object. A trade object gets created. on the day the trade is executed, but a trade has a different value date. It's usually T+3. So we need to enrich it with the value date. Then we need to compute the tax fee information which the trade needs to have, because for every trade we have specific domain rules. We have business logic which we need to apply in order to get the appropriate set of tax and fee. Then we need to compute the net value, and then we have some other steps like SSI standing instructions which we need to add to the trade in order to determine its place of settlement. And then we can consider a trade to be ready for settlement. That means it moves from one stage to the next stage in pipeline. So you may say that what's the big deal in this? It's only changing states of a newly created trade object, right? And the standard way which we mostly do involves in-place mutation of the same object as it moves from one state to the other. But changing state through in-place mutation is destructive. Why is it so? Because we lose the temporality of the data structure. The moment we update the state with some other state, update an object with some other state, we lose the history of it. What about audits? If the auditor asks you to trace through the life cycle of a trade in order to verify that nothing bad has been done, no foul play has been involved, what exactly can we do? We have no way to trace this unless we explicitly save all of the states in our durable store. So the moment we update a trade with a tax fee information, it does not mean that it was not valued at zero tax some time back. When it was created, it had zero tax fee. Now it has some tax fee. The thing that it has tax fee now doesn't take away the fact that it didn't have the tax fee some time back. And if we take a detailed look at it, we will find that in actual real world, the domain also behaves like this only. When we have the trade created, it really doesn't have any tax fee. And then it gets some tax fee information slapped onto it. But still, in the real world, we have the history that this trade existed at some point in time without any tax fee. Also, suppose we are using in-place mutation and we have gone ahead in the life cycle of the trade, and then we have some problem in the system for which we need to roll back to any particular point in time. How do we do that? We have lost the information. So with in-place mutation, we are just being lossy. The solution is to keep information in such a way that we have every bit of detail stored as the object changes from one state to another. In object-oriented world, we have a design pattern for this. The Gang of Four book documents a pattern named memento, which actually allows you to move back in time using undos. But using a powerful language and a powerful architectural paradigm, we can have this thing baked in within the architecture itself. Event sourcing is one such application. Using event sourcing, we can go back in time. Event sourcing preserves the temporality of the data structure. Here we don't represent state as a mutable object. We don't make in-place updates. Instead of that, we accept what we call domain events. Domain events are nothing fictitious. They are actual real events happening in the real world. as a trade object moves through its pipeline. So instead of representing state as a mutable object, we represent a state, we represent state changes as a sequence of domain events that took place right from the creation till the current point in time. And these events will be immutable. Once we have an event, we cannot update it, we cannot go back and update it. If we have to update it, we will have to issue a compensating event. So in that case, we have audit that it was rolled back. And by doing this, what we are doing is we are decoupling the state of the object from its identity. None of the state management or event handling things will be there in the trade object itself. The trade object is the core domain abstraction, which should only portray what are the attributes, what kind of attributes or what core business logic it does. A trade object is never bothered about how the state transitions take place or how the events will be handled from the external world. For that, we will have coarser level abstractions. Decouple the state of the object from its identity. The state changes over time. The identity is immutable. This is how we can model domain events as behaviors. When the new trade object is created, we call it state as created, and we call the event new trade. So these events will be first class abstractions in our model. We will actually have classes or objects which represent these events. When it moves to the next state, we call it at time t1, we process an event add value date and take the object to the next state equal to value date added. Then we do its enrichment. So similarly, we take the object forward, engineering all the state changes, yet keeping the object decoupled from handling any of those impacts. And at each stage, we are persisting the event, persisting the state along with the event in a chronological order. Now, what does this extra storage give us? As I was telling, that we now have the ability to recreate any previous state of the system starting from any point in time in the past. So we have the entire history of the state changes which the trade object went through. Now, we will see later how we can persist these events and states. Before that, let's have a look at how we can represent them as ADTs, algebraic data types. Trading event, and we have a few types of events, and we have states, and we have some of the valid states in the system. Now suppose we have how do we go to the current state of a trade? Suppose we need to bring a trade back to some current state. We don't have any in-memory copy of the current state of the trade object. We have everything persisted. So what we can do is we can start with the initial state and we apply all the state transitions that we have persisted in our durable store to come to the current state. Now in large systems, this may seem expensive, but there are ways to optimize this. Snapshotting is a typical technique for this. In order to optimize, if we have a huge set of trades with a long history of state changes, then it may take quite some time to replay the entire thing once again. So the way to optimize is to use snapshotting. Periodically, we can do a snapshot and save the state in the durable store, so that when we want to replay, we can start from the last snapshot position. So what's the essence of event sourcing? Store the events in a durable repository They are the lowest level granular structure that model the actual behavior of the domain. What we are doing is we are just replicating what the domain does in the real world, and we are storing the events at the lowest level of granularity so that we don't lose any information. And doing so, you can always recreate any state if you store events since the creation of the domain object. Now, here's an interesting duality in the two architectures. In event sourcing, we are storing the history in a way which we can replay later. In functional programming, there are data structures called persistent data structures, which actually does this thing in memory. With a persistent data structure, you can go back to any state change at any point in time. So, both these paradigms, event sourcing and functional modeling, both of them focus on immutability and purity. So, this is an interesting observation which makes us think that these two should gel well when we talk about designing a complete domain model with persistence taken into account. Because even with event sourcing, we are actually persisting the events. So, we have the entire history of the system in our durable store, but we are storing it in a different way than what we are used to do it right now. So, this we call event sourced domain models. So, now comes the next step in the design. How are we going to organize this event handling logic? How are we going to monitor the state changes? Should we club everything into the trade object and make it the kitchen sink of the business logic, the attributes, as well as handling of all the events and state changes? There's a better alternative. The trade object models the core business of the trading logic. It manifests all the state changes. Once it goes through the various state changes, the effects are slapped onto the trade object, but ideally it should be decoupled from the logic that handles the state, that handles the state management, or that handles the event part. Event handling and managing state transitions is something that belongs to the service layer of the domain model. So, trade is at the lowest level of granularity. On top of trade, we have a trading service layer. So, trading service layer is at a much coarser level of abstraction, and trading service layer can interact with trade object as well as some other objects also, which it needs to offer a complete trading service to its clients. So, this is how we separate the concerns. We organize the service layer as receiving events from the context, managing state transitions, and delegates to trade object for core business. At the end of the day, the service layer has to invoke some method, has to invoke some function which does the actual work, and for that it delegates to the trade object. And since we are handling events, we are persisting events in a repository, we can set up our architecture so that there are other subscribers which subscribe to these events. So, this is also part of the architecture, that since we are handling events, there may be other listeners, other parties interested in listening to these events and take some action based on those events. On the other hand, the core domain layer, it implements the core business logic, and there's a collaboration between the service layer and the domain layer, and the collaboration is from the service layer to the domain layer. The domain layer is not expected to invoke any function from the service layer. So, ideally the domain layer should be strictly oblivious of the context in which it's acting. In a typical architecture, what happens is that we have the events which come from the external context. The events get persisted to the durable repository, and but suppose in a typical application, this is not the only thing we want to do. We would like to have the queries also, right? And if the user wants to query, we can't show him the sequence of events and tell them, figure out yourself what's the latest status of the trade is. So for query service, we take it up differently as one of the listeners of this event handling service. So the domain service actually has a listener which will be the query service, which listens to these events, and it prepares a query model on its own. And the good part is that we can, since we have decoupled this thing from how we handle the updates, we can design it as an asynchronous service. And this takes us to the next slide, where we follow this paradigm CQRS, command query responsibility segregation. In a typical application, the commands are the updates and the queries are the reads. So when we will query, we want the data to be shaped in a different way than while we are processing the updates. While handling the updates, we can just push it into a durable repository as a sequence of events. And we know that if we can apply, if we replay those events, we will reach to the final state which the trade object is in right now. But for the query, the user will expect the current state of the trade, current state of the object. So for the query, say we can use a relational database, and all events, we can listen to those events and go on updating the relational model.
This is only, like, so what you described so far is the way that every MPCC-based database works, except I'm building myself instead of using something that already exists. So if I'm always looking at the current snapshot in the read path, then what is the difference between doing all of this extra work and just using Postgres?
No, actually, the storage of events, it's not the relational database. The events we can store in a different kind of database, which supports fast append.
Yeah. What I'm saying is that is fundamentally no different than using a system that already implies a VCC. So if I don't have online access to the history, then there would be no difference.
Yeah, the thing we are.
Yeah,
the thing we are doing here is that we are decoupling the two things, and this query handling part is completely asynchronous. So your updates can continue to flow, and the query service acts as a listener to this service, so that it can listen to events and and prepare the query model in an asynchronous way.
Yes, but when is that useful?
When is that useful?
When is that different than I would use that? If I'm writing to Postgres and I can read from Postgres, when is that?
Yeah, there you are handling the updates and the reads from the same data store, right?
When is this more useful than that?
Write scalability. When you have lots of writes, RDBMS cannot handle write scalability in a way. There are systems, there are durable stores which can handle write scalability in a better way than a relational database. So if I can avoid writing and reading simultaneously from the same data store, in that case I get an advantage with scalability.
One question. Yes. You said the queries are done against the snapshot, but what happens to the current state? The snapshots are not continuously taken, are they?
No. Snapshot is related to the event store. Okay, I store the state changes as events, right? And periodically I can create a snapshot and store it in the same store. But for query model, it's a different store altogether. It can be a relational database. So my query model becomes the traditional read data structure. I can have a 3NF kind of thing, or I can have a denormalized database also, data schema also, which allows me to do query faster. So doing this, I am segregating the write part from the read part. And there are systems where you can append very fast. So those kinds of systems are used in order to as the durable repository of events.
So when do you finally update the state so that the query can give you the final result? Is it
it depends on the query service. The query service is responsible for that, because the shape in which the data is coming and events are getting updated to the durable store, the query data model can be completely different. The user may want to look at the data at a different shape than how updates are processed. The updates are at a very granular level. But when the user wants to see a query result, he wants it in a shape which he can understand. It's at a much higher level of abstraction. So the query service or any other service, say you can have a reporting service also. So they are actually responsible for preparing the shape of the data which they would like to show to the users.
You may have one query store for your analysts, you may have another one for your executives.
Right.
You may have another one, and they all listen to the command store to get updates.
Exactly.
You know, some stores may not care about a trade until it's been completed. Others may want to see every step of the way. You know.
And because of this, the client can get the history through that query store, through that event store, rather than getting just the file state.
Yeah, it's possible to show the history to the client, but the history is the purpose of the history is also to keep a log of what has happened in the system till date.
That's the part that I don't get, because the store that you're using is going to do that for you. Cassandra does that for you. All the already done is do that for you. What you've described here is a write-ahead log.
Write-ahead log, right,
They're doing
right.
that for you, so why is that explicitly necessary? Other than the parity with functional programming, why is that part necessary?
Well, one of the benefits you get of having that is you do have the history immediately present. And that's what the wall, like in Postgres, is that once it gets updated on disk, it doesn't even necessarily have the events that happened. It's just what changed on disk.
Right, but when am I going to care, is what I'm saying. When am I going to need this history such that I have to incur the overhead to actually load it in?
I could see this as being very useful as a more useful, instead of having a separate logging service that's logging all of the events on your site, and also you're doing your updates to whatever your persistent store. Here you would have one source of that entire history. You know that you are logging everything that actually happened.
Right.
Rather than just the.
No, I get what it does.
Yeah.
I'm saying, when would I care?
I would care a lot of that, being able to do a lot of, being able to see like demographic information on the site that I work at, like figuring out behavior of users, things that are happening. Maybe from a
So you're logging that already.
No,
That's not
not
like an event
necessarily.
source concern, right? I mean, those are event logs.
Yeah, but what
That's an
happens?
application level concern. This is not application level, this is infrastructure level, right? I mean, like, in that case, I am storing each of the events because I need it for the job. In this case, I'm storing the events because it's cool. Like,
No. Here we are storing the events. It can also be used for business requirements, doing analytics, data analytics.
that's not clear from the separation here, right?
It can also be used for auditing. Like,
Auditing is one of the applications, right?
when does this change happen?
You can turn that on in any relational database, though, right? You can turn that audit log on.
No, but what I'm saying is, listen, right, like, what I'm saying is that you can do all of that stuff with this, right? But you can do all of that stuff without it. So in what case does CQRS and event sourcing give me something more than I had before?
Look, here you are storing domain events, right? In a relational database, you can have the history at the database level, which may not correspond to the domain level. So here, with such a log, you can do analysis at a much more domain level than with the relational database log that you are talking about.
And there is also an added advantage that in case in the past there was an error in the data input,
Yeah.
you can completely correct that history.
Yes, you can take your system back. Yeah, I mentioned that you can take your system back in time. Back in time. Yeah.
Isn't it also that you can project any domain representation off of the event stream?
Yes. You can have multiple projections, multiple views of the events. The big data, the analytics people may want to have a different view. Then the query service may want to have a different view. Reporting service may want to have a different view. You can project in a different domain-friendly way.
It would just seem to me that you would need a fairly large or complex system in order for this to be worth it, since you're essentially,
Yeah, that's true.
you're
That's true.
essentially creating a distributed
Yeah.
database.
Yeah.
Writing it by hand.
Yeah. So the domain service layer actually handles the events and the state changes. In other words, the domain service layer acts as the state machine. So why not make it explicit? We can actually model the domain service layer as a state machine, so that the user gets so the domain service layer design becomes much more expressive to the user. So what we can do is we can call it trade life cycle, because that's what really it manages. The service layer manages the trade life cycle, and we can have a state machine which runs within an actor model. Akka gives us one, and we can use that to model our domain service layer. Modeling the domain service layer as a finite state machine based on actors is one of the things that we are experimenting right now. We haven't yet delivered any production application with this, but this looks like quite a potent thing to do. The finite state machine in Akka is available as a mix-in for the Akka actor. You can actually make an actor listen, and it's designed similar to Erlang's GenFSM. As a client, so the moment we are talking about a state machine, all that the client cares for are the state transition rules, what events come and how I handle that event. So in the code snippet which is there in the next slide, you will see that this becomes extremely expressive using a first-class state machine as an implementation. This is a sample snippet code from the domain service layer, which uses Akka FSM. The initial state is created. When the trade is in the created state, if it gets an event, add value date, then it does these kinds of things. We do a log. We invoke a domain method from the domain abstraction. This gossip call actually notifies the observers, and then finally it takes it and finally move to the next state of the trade life cycle. And there are lots of other options which you can do, but the meat of the thing is that once again it makes the domain logic very expressive. We are implementing a state machine. By making it explicit, using a proper implementation of the state machine, we can make the code very expressive. These are the three main things which it does. It handles events and processes data updates and state changes, logs events, notifies listeners.
You're logging the created, but you're not logging the value date event.
Yeah, that.
You notify the transition, but you don't actually log it here.
Yeah, event E.
No, it's created. Look.
No, the event which it handles is this last parameter E. And to make the state change, we use type lens. This add value date was invoked here, and we use type lens for this. And as you can see that this is a purely referentially transparent implementation. Notifying listeners, this is typically used when we have multiple subscribers to our service, as in CQRS. A bit of implementation of the FSM. The FSM in Akka, it extends listeners, and listeners, what it gives is, it gives the listening capability on top of an actor implementation. Event logging is done asynchronously, and as we will see that event logging is, the logging part is also done using actors. This is the sample of the event log. And actually you can log events in multiple stores, multiple ways. You can do an in-memory logging, you can have various stores using Redis, Mongo, whatever. one thing which we need to take care of is when we are logging asynchronously in an actor-based model, we need to ensure that the logs appear in the proper order. So with Akka, you can configure it with a pinned dispatcher, which will pin it to the thread so that the ordering is preserved when you do the logging. This is the log event class. The logger is modeled as an actor, and when it receives an event, log event, in that case it does the logging to the appropriate store. Here I am using a Redis based event log. And this append async, this method is also not blocking, so it returns a future, as with most of the things in Akka, so that it doesn't block. And this is a snapshot of the part of the service layer code. Once again, the point is that the point I want to emphasize is the expressivity which it brings. Actually, Akka's FSM gives us a nice DSL to do these things.
Why did you make that a class? There's only going to be one of these, right?
Sorry?
How come you made that a class? Like you wouldn't want an instance of this for each trade, right?
I can have multiple instances.
Yeah, but you wouldn't necessarily want that.
Necessarily, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. So this is a sample implementation. Usage of our abstraction, creates the state machine, registers listeners, and fires events, and wait for the result. With the, yeah.
I notice you're using futures, but isn't, I mean, that is going to introduce blocking, right? I mean, anytime you have a future, someone else is going to then have to like.
Yeah, with futures, you will have to wait at the end, but you can compose in intermediate futures. So that's the thing. At one point in time, definitely you will have to wait for the result, but the idea is to push it back as much as possible. So the summary: event sourcing is an emerging trend in architecting large systems, focusing on immutability, and hence it plays well with functional programming principles. Event stores are append only, hence no locks, no very fast at the event storage layer. But there may be some cases where you need to maintain complicated in-memory snapshots. Suppose you may need to maintain a list of trades and handle updates. So in that case, you need to use this architecture in collaboration with an STM implementation, and that's also possible with Akka. Akka has an STM implementation, and Scala is also going to have an STM. So in designing your data model based on event sourcing, make your core model abstractions meaty enough, while leaving the service layer with the responsibilities of managing event handling and state transitions. So this is an architectural paradigm with which we are experimenting right now. We haven't yet, as I was telling you, we haven't yet delivered any production application, but it looks promising. And if we can have some good STM implementations and good actor implementations, asynchronous messaging, these things should work well to give us a successful implementation of this paradigm.